When Prince Edward stepped out of the royal council chamber, eyes sunken and voice trembling, few knew he carried a truth that would shake the monarchy to its core. A secret buried for decades had just resurfaced, and it didn't favor Camilla. What the Queen Mother hid in her final instructions wasn't just shocking, it was a deliberate exclusion, a stunning act of royal defiance from beyond the grave. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The corridor outside the chamber had never felt heavier. Those who saw Edward that day swore he looked as though he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. His composure, usually steady, usually measured, had fractured. He did not rush past aides, he did not offer reassurance. He simply paused, inhaled slowly, and allowed the weight of history to settle on his shoulders. Inside that closed-door meeting, something irreversible had happened. A seal had been broken. A voice from another era had spoken again. Moments earlier, Edward had sat beside Princess Anne at the long polished table where the family's most delicate matters are handled, without press, without spectacle, without mercy. It was Anne who first noticed his hands trembling as the leather-bound folder was placed before him. She leaned closer, whispering something too low for anyone else to hear. Those who watched said her expression was not shock, it was recognition. As if she had always known this day would come, as if she had been waiting. The document had not been discovered by accident. It was unearthed during a quiet archival review routine, bureaucratic, harmless, or so they believed. Tucked within coded royal records, protected by layers of protocol, lay a set of handwritten notes in unmistakable ink. Across the top, in firm and unwavering script, were the words, "For the future monarchs, my final duty." The Queen Mother's handwriting was steady, deliberate, impossible to misinterpret. This was not sentimental reflection. This was instruction. An insider later described the silence in the room as Edward began to read. Each name was spoken carefully, each directive measured. There were mentions of safeguarding tradition, of protecting the moral image of the crown, of ensuring that future generations would understand sacrifice over desire. And then came the omission that struck harder than any accusation could have. Camilla's name was nowhere to be found. Not in ceremonial guidance, not in advisory influence, not even in symbolic acknowledgement. It was not an oversight, it was absence by design. Gasps were not audible, but the tension was suffocating. Some stared at the table, others at Charles, but Edward continued, voice faltering only once before he regained control. In that moment, he was no longer the quiet youngest brother. He was the reluctant messenger of a matriarch's final judgment. And when he finished, when the last page settled against the wood, there was no confusion left in the chamber. The Queen Mother had made her will known. Camilla had been deliberately excluded from the vision she left behind. Edward did not want to confirm it publicly. Those close to him say he wrestled with the decision long after the meeting adjourned. To reveal the existence of such instructions would ignite division. To hide them would betray the very legacy they were meant to protect. And so he chose transparency, even if it meant reopening wounds that had never fully healed. His statement was brief, controlled, but devastating in its implications. The Queen Mother, he confirmed, had left guidance that did not include Camilla in her enduring blueprint for the monarchy. The palace has survived scandals, abdications, betrayals. But this felt different. This was not a rumor, not speculation, not tabloid fiction. It was written, signed, preserved, and now acknowledged. And as whispers began threading their way through royal walls, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was not a spontaneous act of resentment from a bygone era. It was a conviction formed long ago, rooted in history, emotion, and a quiet fury that had never faded. But this wasn't a mere oversight, it was intentional. And the truth behind the Queen Mother's decision traces back to a time long before Camilla ever stepped foot in the palace. While the world accepted Camilla with time, the Queen Mother never did. Behind royal smiles and public protocol, an emotional war brewed in silence. This was not about titles or scandals. It was about loyalty, legacy, and a betrayal she believed the crown should never forget. Her reasons until now were kept private. Until now. To understand the magnitude of the Queen Mother's rejection, one must first understand the depth of her devotion to her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, and to the legacy of Princess Diana. To the Queen Mother, these women represented the heart of the monarchy, poised, principled, and loyal to the idea of service above self. She had lived through abdications, wars, and betrayals, and emerged each time with her belief in duty hardened like steel. Her vision of the crown was not flexible, it was absolute, and anything that threatened that ideal, especially from within, was treated as treachery cloaked in civility. From the moment Camilla entered the periphery of royal life, the Queen Mother sensed something disruptive, something that, if left unchecked, could unravel the moral authority she had spent her life upholding. Her correspondence in her final years, now quietly circulating among senior royals, tells the real story. In private letters, the Queen Mother expressed clear disdain not only for the scandal that Camilla embodied during Charles's marriage, but for what she believed was an erosion of the monarchy's symbolic weight. She never wrote in cruelty. Her words were controlled, dignified, and sharp like a blade polished for years. She wrote of Charles's emotional vulnerability and how, in her words, he has chosen comfort over command. She believed Camilla had not only influenced Charles's personal life, but had weakened his public role as the future king. To the Queen Mother, Camilla was not a partner, she was a liability. Her judgment extended further. What struck some of the royals who later read her reflections was not just her concern for tradition, but her deep moral objection. She questioned how the public would reconcile a woman tied so publicly to the destruction of Diana's marriage with the role of queen consort. The monarchy could not afford emotional contradiction, she believed it required moral clarity. And Camilla's presence in her eyes blurred that clarity beyond repair. Even as public sentiment slowly warmed to Camilla, the Queen Mother's conviction remained immovable. In contrast, her admiration for Catherine, then the Duchess of Cambridge, grew stronger in those final years. The Queen Mother viewed Catherine as a breath of restoration, a return to dignity, warmth, and control-led elegance. She reportedly referred to her in private as the future face of the crown, a quiet signal of where she hoped the power would one day concentrate. She believed Catherine's influence on William was stabilizing, not compromising. That contrast between Camilla's association with chaos and Catherine's embodiment of composure was not lost on her. And that contrast became central to the vow she made behind closed doors. According to one former aide, the Queen Mother made a private oath shortly after Diana's funeral. She would not live long enough to shape the future of the monarchy herself, but she could influence it from behind the curtain. She began curating a list not of heirs, but of those she believed would be the right stewards of the crown's moral image, those who would preserve the essence of monarchy as she understood it. It was not a legal document, it had no constitutional power, but it was personal, emotional, and, as we now know, influential enough to cast a long shadow over royal decisions 2 decades later. That vow to preserve a line of influence rooted in honor rather than convenience would eventually evolve into the secret instructions now tearing through the palace. It was a silent rebellion wrapped in velvet tradition, and although many assumed her impact died with her, the Queen Mother's vision had simply been lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to erupt. That moment, as Prince Edward revealed, has arrived. The judgment once whispered in guarded halls is now echoing across the monarchy. And Camilla, once at the center of a quiet storm, now finds herself on the wrong side of a matriarch's legacy. But words weren't all she left behind. She put pen to paper with chilling clarity. What she wrote would be hidden in royal archives for decades, locked in a private drawer for over 20 years. Behind layers of archival code and royal security was a document sealed by the Queen Mother herself, recently unsealed under strict ceremonial protocol. Its contents weren't financial, they were personal. Names were listed. But one name, Camilla's, was deliberately missing. The item was known only to a few under the highest classification of royal confidentiality. Catalogued under an innocuous title, it had remained undisturbed in the royal archives beneath Windsor, its true nature concealed even from seasoned staff. It wasn't until a recent generational handover, audit and internal recalibration of influence and responsibility that a specific instruction from long ago resurfaced. The archivist, unaware of its explosive content, followed procedure. The moment the Queen Mother's seal was identified, everything stopped. Protocol dictated that this level of personal testament could not be opened without the presence of key senior royals. Within hours, an emergency gathering was arranged behind thick walls and locked gates. Charles entered first, guarded and unreadable. William, his expression rigid, followed with measured steps. Anne took her usual place, sharp, focused, ready. And Edward, now bearing the weight of what he had already confirmed, stood silently at the edge. As the royal archivist presented the leather folder, the tension inside the chamber was almost physical. There were no cameras, no advisors, no room for denial. The folder was opened with solemn care, revealing 3 crisp pages in the unmistakable hand of the Queen Mother. It began formally, outlining her intention to preserve certain symbolic legacies for what she described as the lineal integrity of the crown. The second page was more pointed. She detailed a list of individuals to whom she entrusted heirlooms of not just physical value, but historical and spiritual weight jewels, letters and symbolic tokens meant to carry generational meaning. William's name appeared. So did Catherine's. Even young Lady Louise was cited as the quiet strength yet to bloom. But it was the final page that changed everything. With her words, the Queen Mother wielded more power than most realized she still held. She addressed what she called the temptation of compromise in pursuit of peace. Her tone sharpened as she warned against mistaking public acceptance for moral alignment. And then, in a sentence that would burn into memory, she wrote, "Let no crown rest upon the shoulders of one who was never meant to carry its weight. She was never to hold the crown in my eyes." The silence in the room was broken only by a single audible gasp. No one needed to ask who she referred to. Camilla's name was absent from every section. No ceremonial acknowledgement. No mention among legacy recipients. No symbolic gesture reserved for her. It wasn't exclusion by mistake, it was erasure by design. The Queen Mother had ensured her wishes would be delivered posthumously, not to create public scandal, but to leave no doubt about the path she believed the crown must follow. For Charles, the moment was devastating. There was no defence to mount, no excuse to craft. This was not an outsider's opinion, it was his grandmother's final judgment. Edward, though visibly strained, was the one who read the final page aloud, his voice cracking slightly as he reached the damning sentence. He did not flinch, but those in the room say the emotional cost was etched into his face long after. William's silence was not passive. He studied the pages with an intensity that suggested resolve. Anne sat unmoved, as though the words only confirmed what she had long suspected. The atmosphere shifted from shock to recognition. This was no longer speculation. It was a declared stance from the monarchy's revered elder, a stance that would inevitably trigger consequence. And yet, despite the weight of what had just occurred, no statement was issued to the public. The matter, as with all palace secrets, was contained. But the walls of Windsor speak, and the corridors of the palace, ever alive with hushed voices, soon began to echo with a single haunting question: what does this mean for Camilla? As the whispers spread across the palace corridors, Camilla demanded answers, but what she didn't expect was the quiet support behind the Queen Mother's wish. As the news ignited royal chaos, 2 women stepped forward not in protest but in quiet confirmation. Princess Anne and Sophie Wessex revealed they had known all along. Bound by a royal sisterhood and sworn to protect the Queen Mother's legacy, they had guarded the truth, until now. Long before Edward ever confirmed the sealed instructions, Anne had been prepared. Her loyalty to the Queen Mother was not just familial, it was forged in principle. She had grown up under the stern yet loving guidance of a woman who believed the monarchy must stand tall, even when the world begged it to bend. The Queen Mother's values were etched into Anne's sense of duty, resilience, discipline, and legacy above all. So when the private notes first came to light, when the instructions excluding Camilla were first read in hushed tones, Anne didn't flinch. She already knew what her grandmother would say, and more importantly, she knew why. Sophie's involvement, however, surprised many, but those closest to the late Queen Mother knew better. In the twilight of her life, the Queen Mother sought companionship not of status, but of spirit. Sophie, kind and astute, often visited her at Clarence's house. Their conversations, though undocumented, were described by aides as intensely personal. It was during those quiet evenings, as the monarchy weathered new public storms, that the Queen Mother spoke of her final plans. She confided her hopes, her regrets, her unwavering conviction that Camilla should never be elevated beyond what the public could stomach. To Sophie, she whispered not commands but clarity. The day the Queen Mother passed, both Anne and Sophie received private notes, hand-delivered and marked with the royal cipher. Inside were copies of the same testament Edward would later read aloud. Neither woman shared what they received, not with Charles, not even with their spouses. It was a vow made in silence, kept in unity. "We knew what she wanted," Sophie admitted years later in private. "We had to wait for the right moment." That moment arrived when the seal was broken, and with it, a wave of denial swept through royal ranks. Camilla was the first to push back. At Balmoral, she cornered Anne and Sophie during a private weekend gathering, demanding clarity. Those present say Camilla's voice trembled. Why? A mix of outrage and heartbreak. She demanded to know how long they had known, why they hadn't intervened, why she had been kept in the dark. Anne's response was cold, unyielding, and final, "You were never part of her plan." The room fell into a silence so heavy it choked any further conversation. Sophie, ever diplomatic, reportedly looked away, tears brimming but unshed. The confrontation marked a turning point. Camilla, once cautiously confident in her standing, began to feel the walls around her shift. No public statement followed, no dramatic gestures, but within palace walls, alliances were clear, and so was the emerging narrative. The Queen Mother's legacy had defenders, and they were no longer hiding. As Anne and Sophie stepped out of the shadows, their loyalty became a weapon, not one used to wound, but to preserve. And as they stood behind Edward's revelation, it became evident this was no isolated act. It was a coordinated upholding of a vision crafted decades ago. The Queen Mother's final move wasn't just emotional, it was legal. And now, one document has emerged that could change Camilla's fate forever. Buried within a forgotten legal archive was a document drafted but never delivered. A royal decree meant to guide the monarchy's future, signed by the Queen Mother herself, listed those approved for symbolic succession influence. Charles was there, William, even Catherine. But Camilla's name was nowhere on the page, and that omission now carries legal weight. For decades, the royal decree system operated in silence, not laws in the parliamentary sense, but deeply respected frameworks used internally to influence ceremonial duties, strategic succession planning, and the quiet curation of royal presence. These decrees, often written by elder royals and kept in private vaults, were passed from monarch to monarch, guiding, not dictating. Most are ceremonial, meant to honor legacy, carry forward values, and subtly shape the image of the monarchy, but some, like this one, were written not as reflections of the past, but as warnings for the future. It was a junior legal aide in the palace who stumbled across the decree during a clearance of outdated documentation. Initially misfiled among historic property charters, the envelope bore the unmistakable royal crest and a wax seal cracked from time. What he found inside was not protocol, it was personal doctrine, titled on continuity and custodianship. It was signed with a trembling but resolute hand, Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The language was elegant, but the message was piercing. The document named specific individuals she believed should serve as stewards of the monarchy's moral compass in the decades to come. Charles, naturally, led the list, but not without qualification. Then came William, described as the hope and heart of continuity. Next, Catherine, the emblem of composure and grace. Lady Louise Windsor was shockingly included, named as the keeper of silent strength, followed by a nod to young Princess Charlotte, whose spirit, the Queen Mother claimed, reminded her of herself. But it was who was not named that sent the legal wing of the palace into a frenzy. Nowhere in the decree, not even in footnotes or ceremonial suggestions, did the name Camilla appear. No acknowledgement, no exclusion, just absence of silence louder than any denial. The implications were enormous. While the document held no authority in law, its symbolic weight, especially being written by the Queen Mother, was undeniable. Internally, it launched an immediate review. Was it deliberately withheld? Was Charles aware? And most importantly, had this decree already influenced decisions without anyone realizing? Edward, once again, became the reluctant bearer of revelation. When the document reached his desk, his first instinct was to suppress it. But legacy, he believed, deserved transparency. He presented the decree to the senior royals in a confidential assembly. Reactions were mixed. William was reportedly calm but cold. Catherine remained silent, her name now solidified as a favoured heir to legacy, not just title. Anne, as expected, supported the Queen Mother's intentions. But Charles sat in silence, his eyes fixed on a corner of the page where his mother's handwriting trailed off into a slight tremble. He said nothing. He didn't need to. And though the decree would never be made public, its effects were immediate. Ceremonial roles were quietly reassessed. Public appearances subtly shifted. Camilla, once navigating the court with growing confidence, now found herself circled by an invisible line she could not cross. Her absence from the document wasn't dismissed. It was debated, dissected, and ultimately accepted as the Queen Mother's final symbolic veto. But just when it seemed the drama had peaked, another letter emerged, one meant for Charles alone, filled with heartbreak, warning, and final judgment. It began with 3 words: "My dear Charles." Found tucked into the Queen Mother's private diary, this personal letter was addressed to her beloved grandson. But what followed wasn't love, it was a sorrowful reprimand. Her disappointment in his choices, her heartbreak over his path, her chilling hope that he would one day understand why Camilla must never wear the crown. The letter came to light not through ceremony but chance. During a quiet inventory of the Queen Mother's personal effects, Princess Anne stumbled across the diary, its pages brittle, its spine worn, but its contents painfully alive. She opened it, not as a royal, but as a daughter and niece seeking connection. Instead, she found revelation. Tucked neatly between entries on family reflections and national moments was the folded letter, addressed in that unmistakable script. Its ink had not faded, its message had not softened. It was, in every word, a mirror of sorrow, restraint, and maternal duty. Anne knew immediately it was not hers to read alone. When Charles received it, he did not open it in haste. He sat with it for hours, fingers tracing its edge, shoulders stiff with expectation, and when he finally unfolded the letter, he was met with the voice of the one woman who had, all his life, both adored him and demanded more of him. "I've watched your heart wander," she wrote, "but the crown needs certainty, not passion." It was not a cruel statement, it was a line drawn by someone who had sacrificed everything for stability. She spoke of his upbringing, his legacy, and the weight that comes with being more than just a man but a symbol. Her words became more direct with every sentence. She described Camilla not as an enemy, but as a fracture, a CE that would always divide rather than unify. "She may bring you comfort," the Queen Mother confessed, "but she cannot carry the crown." The heartbreak in her words was undeniable. She didn't condemn him, she mourned him, mourned the path he had chosen, mourned the weight she feared he would one day place on the monarchy's shoulders. Her final sentiment struck deep. You may not see it now, but history will. When Charles emerged from the room where he read it, he said nothing. His face was pale, eyes red-rimmed but dry. Aides said he walked past them without notice. Others say he stood in the hallway for several minutes, as if unsure whether to walk forward or turn back. He never spoke of the letter publicly. He never responded. But those close to him say something in him changed that day. There was a visible retreat, a soft withdrawal from the forceful defense he had always offered when it came to Camilla. Not rejection, but resignation. A silent acknowledgement that the crown he would one day wear came with ghosts that still whispered. That letter became a turning point not just for Charles, but for the entire royal household. It was no longer about preference or scandal, it was about legacy, and for William, watching his father absorb the weight of generational disappointment, it became a catalyst. Because while Charles withdrew into silence, another royal took bold action: his son. Prince William was not about to let history repeat itself. Prince William had read the Queen Mother's decree, and for him, it wasn't history, it was a warning. Behind palace doors, William began making moves, reshuffling ceremonial duties, altering future coronation scripts, and slowly but surely, ensuring Camilla's role was redefined. Not in malice, but in obedience to the crown's eldest matriarch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't send a statement. Instead, William did what only the next in line could. He recalibrated the rhythm of the monarchy without asking permission. The first sign came when Camilla was quietly excluded from a scheduled diplomatic banquet. The palace released a vague statement about health, but insiders knew better. In her place stood Catherine, calm and radiant, representing the family with the grace the Queen Mother once praised so deeply. Then came the ceremonial adjustments, subtle, almost invisible to the public, but unmistakable within royal circles. Seating orders revised. Processional placements altered. Even invitations for events traditionally shared between the king and queen were adjusted. Camilla's presence downgraded, Catherine's role amplified. Behind the scenes, William met privately with Edward and Anne. These weren't emotional gatherings, they were strategic alignments. He laid out his interpretation of the Queen Mother's words, his belief that the future of the crown required clarity, not confusion. Edward, already burdened by the weight of exposing the instructions, agreed in quiet resolve. Anne, never one for dramatic displays, simply nodded and offered 3 words that sealed her support. She was right. Together, they began to reinforce the hierarchy not by rank, but by influence. William's stance wasn't born out of personal bitterness. It was duty, cold and resolute. "We serve the crown, not emotion," he reportedly told an aide after Catherine replaced Camilla at a heritage charity reception that had, until recently, been Camilla's responsibility. Those who had watched William grow into his role began to see a different side. Not the dutiful heir, but the strategic protector of a vision left behind by a woman he barely knew but fully understood. He wasn't dismantling the monarchy, he was fortifying it, restoring a balance that had, in his eyes, tilted dangerously towards sentiment and compromise. And yet, it wasn't war, he declared. It was containment, a slow but deliberate drawing of boundaries around Camilla's place in royal life. No public humiliation, no aggressive headlines, just a methodical recalibration that mirrored the Queen Mother's final plea: preserve the crown by preserving its dignity. Even Charles, though visibly unsettled by the shift, made no move to stop it. Perhaps after reading the Queen Mother's letter, he recognized the momentum was not in his favor. Perhaps he realized the future belonged to his son now, not to the compromises of his past. Camilla, however, felt the shift, and while she did not challenge William directly, sources say she began to withdraw, less visible, less vocal, more reserved. Not by choice, but by consequence. The Queen Mother's influence had travelled through time and bloodlines to shape the monarchy once more, and William, quiet but unyielding, had chosen his side. But it wasn't just policy being reshaped. The jewels, the titles, the symbols of legacy, these too were quietly redirected, triggering a final confrontation. Camilla had kept silent long enough. As whispers became headlines and the Queen Mother's legacy reshaped her future, she demanded answers. The confrontation inside Windsor Castle was raw, bitter, and unforgettable. A woman round but never accepted. A family torn between modern duty and ancient loyalty, and a truth no one could deny: Camilla was never part of the Queen Mother's vision. The room was thick with tension before she even entered. No aides, no press, just blood, memory, and the heavy burden of unspoken truths. Charles stood by the window, his back turned, while William and Anne waited with eyes that betrayed no emotion. When Camilla broke the silence with a single question: "Why wasn't I told?" It shattered the illusion of unity the family had desperately tried to maintain. Her voice didn't shake, but her rage was clear. She demanded explanations, not excuses. She wanted to know how long this shadow had been looming over her role, how many knew, and why she was left to walk blindly into a future that had been deliberately written without her. Anne responded first, and she didn't hesitate. "Because you wouldn't have respected it," she said flatly. The words hit harder than any public scandal ever could. Camilla recoiled, not physically but emotionally, her defiance pierced. She turned to Charles, expecting him to defend her, to push back, to shield her from the institutional coldness that now enveloped her. But Charles said nothing. His silence was louder than any rebuke, because he too had read the Queen Mother's letter. He had heard her voice in every word, and no matter how deeply he loved Camilla, he could no longer deny the past had come calling, and it had a name she would never carry. Then came Edward, the quiet orchestrator of truth. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped forward and restated what had already been confirmed. The Queen Mother made her position very clear, and it was not just emotional, it was deliberate. He handed Camilla a copy of the document, not for drama but for dignity, so she could see in the Queen Mother's own hand the extent of the exclusion. Not a mistake, not a misstep, a choice. Camilla held the paper with trembling fingers, but she said nothing. Not a tear, not a word, only silence. She didn't resign. She didn't storm out. But she left the room slower than she entered, her stature slightly smaller, her influence unmistakably dimmed. That night, the palace schedule was updated, 2 upcoming engagements quietly reassigned to Catherine. No announcement, no media uproar, just a subtle shifting of power from one name to another. And for the first time, Camilla didn't resist. She didn't ask why. The royal family had drawn its line, not with speeches or declarations, but with legacy, silence, and the ghost of a matriarch whose influence refused to fade. Camilla's place hadn't been stripped, it had been surrendered. And as Windsor returned to its chilling calm, a quiet consensus emerged. The Queen Mother had spoken, and the family had listened. But even as Camilla stepped back, a final posthumous act of the Queen Mother would seal her message with chilling clarity. Months later, a memorial ceremony was held in honor of the Queen Mother's centenary, a symbolic passing of legacy. As royal family members stood in reverence, the camera caught what royal watchers immediately noticed. Camilla was absent from every symbolic gesture. No wreath, no mention, no placement. The exclusion wasn't accidental. It was the final echo of a matriarch who refused to be silenced. The atmosphere inside Westminster Abbey was somber but stately, with every detail meticulously arranged to reflect the Queen Mother's towering legacy. The royal family lined the front rows in unified silence. Yet behind the graceful solemnity, something unmistakable was missing. As the program unfolded, it became clear to those watching in the pews and across the world Camilla had been written out. Not formally, not cruelly, but unmistakably. When Catherine stepped forward to lay a wreath at the Queen Mother's memorial plaque, it was not merely floral tribute, it was declaration. The ribbon tied to the bouquet bore 5 handwritten words, "For our matriarch we remember." Next came Lady Louise, chosen to recite a passage written by the Queen Mother herself, an unpublished poem about silent service and the cost of duty. Her voice did not waver. Her selection was no coincidence. Louise, a quiet but increasingly visible royal, had been elevated not through ambition, but inheritance of trust. The Queen Mother had once called her the girl with the old soul, and on this day she became the voice of remembrance. As she finished the final line, the Abbey fell into a pause not prompted by protocol, but emotion. Throughout the ceremony, no role, public or ceremonial, had been designated for Camilla. Her name was never read. Her seat, though present, was placed behind senior royals and notably obscured from the cameras. She had not been barred, but she had not been embraced. The symbolism was stark. The Queen Mother's wishes had extended beyond documents and declarations. They had found form in silence, in staging, in memory. The public reaction was immediate and divided. Some saw it as a brutal reminder of a divided house. Others called it justice, an honoring of a woman who had sacrificed her personal peace to protect the image of the crown. But historians were unanimous in their assessment. This was the Queen Mother's final symbolic exile, a decision decades in the making, executed with chilling precision. It was not the scandal that defined Camilla's role, it was the silence. And that silence echoed louder than any speech could have. And as the ceremony concluded, one truth lingered in the air: the Queen Mother's legacy had not only survived, it had prevailed. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.